Bible reading is Mark 13. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house or take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress, unequaled from the beginning when God created the world, until now, and never be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happen, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch.
So as you can see in the passage we've just read out, we now get a massive shift in the lesson that Jesus wants to give as he now moves his teaching to something that will actually happen one day in the future, a long time after he's speaking. Because until now, there's been a lot of lessons which have been given, looking at the kingdom and what it consists of, as well as making it very clear to his disciples and those people he's speaking to why he's come into this world in the first place and how he will soon die now that they have finally arrived in Jerusalem. And after this chapter, that is what the Gospel Mark will, of course, now focus on. Because in the very next chapter, he will be betrayed by Judas and then arrested. And then the rest of the book will focus on both his death and resurrection. So we are obviously very much coming to what is the end of Jesus's earthly mission, as after this, what he has come to do will actually now be accomplished. But of course, before that happens, we get this chapter here, which kind of stands out as being a little bit different, as this is now Jesus speaking about what will happen after all that. What will happen once his mission here on earth ends, as he now talks about what is the fulfillment of the kingdom that he has brought into the world, which has now started, as he now wants to point his disciples towards that future time. Because this is going to be all about the end days, when all that has been promised all through God's word will finally be fulfilled, and all that Jesus has done and what he will soon do by his death and resurrection will now bring about the kingdom that he has been promising. And of course, looking at this will become very relevant for us today, because what Jesus is really talking about is the period of time between his first coming, which is what the Gospel of Mark focuses on, and what is his second coming, which is the time we are now living in. Because we today, right now, are living in what is the age of the church. So we're living in the period of time that is waiting for Jesus' return, as he tells his disciples about here. There's a future time where all these promises that have been given long ago about restoring the creation, making all things new, will one day happen. And now he's letting them know, okay, a lot of stuff's going to happen over the next couple of days, but keep your eye on that. Look forward to this bigger thing. But this, of course, means we are looking at a passage that can be confusing in some ways. And because of that, it could lead to some dangerous assumptions about what this future will look like and when some of these events will happen, which means that when we approach a passage like this, we need to be careful to only understand what is the message of it and not to get bogged down too much in all the details. That we've got to be careful not to create an image in our head of what we think this is all going to look like, because if we do that, we could actually come to some very wrong conclusions. And in fact, we could even lose one of the main points of this passage, which is no one will ever know the day and time that this all happens, so don't assume that you can. Because what we sadly see is that many people have and continue to try to predict the return of Christ. But the main message here actually is that the world we live in and the universe that we live in, it's all heading to a final destination. And therefore, all we need to do now is simply be prepared for what is this inevitable outcome. What we need to do is to be ready for the moment when the Son of God, Jesus Christ, returns to this world to both judge it and to restore it and to take us into his eternal kingdom. But as we don't know when that will happen, then we must live every day like it could happen at any moment. We're not meant to be spending every day trying to guess whether tomorrow is the day, but instead living today as if tomorrow could be the day. So looking at the passage itself now, we're going to look at this in two parts, as it clearly has two big things to teach us here. The first part, obviously, is that there is a bigger plan beyond just Jesus's mission on earth. As all that he's been doing, it's building up to something massive, which is when the kingdom will be fully realized in the future. That it's not just going to end when he dies and even rises again, it's building up to something more than that. And the second part is that there is a warning given here, that you can't know when all that is going to happen, so you now have to be ready for it today. You've got to live every moment like it could happen at any second. So looking at the first part, which is going to be the larger part, this is going to be the section of verses 1 to 31, most of the passage, in fact. We see this starts with Jesus and the disciples in Jerusalem, where they're at the temple, and we see that the disciples want to bring Jesus' attention to all the other buildings which are in the complex. Right? It is quite a large area. And we see one of them saying, verse 1, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And this is because King Herod, the same one who tried to have Jesus killed as a baby, right? The one who was paranoid about the Messiah coming. Well, he had spent years constructing what is some pretty impressive buildings in the city. The old temple was an absolute joke, but he had actually spent a fortune in building something far grander. And for some of the disciples who, if you remember, were just fishermen from up north of Galilee, they no doubt would have been quite impressed by all this, because they're just basically country people. And now here they are in the big city, and they're looking at all these impressive structures that they just don't have from where they've come from. But then we see Jesus say in verse 2, in response to all this wonder and all this excitement that they have, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So we see that Jesus is actually not impressed, and he simply says that all this stuff, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be destroyed. That it's all going to be wiped out. So forget about it. It just doesn't matter. Because this temple and all the surrounding buildings there, and this area, this complex that has been the center of their religion, well, it no longer matters. Because in this new kingdom that he's bringing, the one that he's pointing towards and talking about, people are not going to worship at a place, but they're going to pray to God through the Spirit wherever they are in the world. That this temple, it doesn't matter anymore. It's just a material thing. From now on, people are going to worship in the Spirit. And this leads the disciples to come to him afterwards, and they ask two critical questions about what this all means. Because in verse 4, we see some of them ask, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" And then the rest of this passage, this section we're looking at, is really just Jesus answering those two questions. The questions of when this will happen and what it is that we're to look for. What are the signs that we truly are at this end point, that it's all starting to happen? And for us today, the answer given here makes it clear that not all these things he talks about are actually going to happen at once. Because it's very obvious that there is not going to be just one moment where it all happens and that's it, but instead the indication given here is that one thing will happen and then another, but all of them together are signaling that we are then moving towards the end, that there is a big moment coming, but there's going to be lots of little steps on the lead up to it. That there's going to be many things over a period of time indicating to those who are paying attention that the end is near, that Jesus will soon return. That the whole world, it's moving towards this final destination, the end of the world as we currently know it, and the coming of the new earth, his kingdom in full. So what that means for us now is that there are things said here that, even though they're talking about the future, they have in fact actually already happened. And there are also at the same time things which are yet to happen. And we're somehow somewhere in the middle of these 2 points on the timeline. And there can be no doubt that some of the things said here have actually already happened in our past. Yet these same things hadn't happened when this was actually being said by Jesus or when the Gospel Mark was written. That for the disciples who are asking these questions of him, it's their future, even if it is our past. Because, for example, Jesus talks about in verses 5 to 8 that there will be earthquakes and famines and wars and even just rumors of wars. And we know that a lot of these things actually happened during the time of Acts, or at least not long after it. Because we know from history, a lot of the stuff Jesus said would happen lines up with what is recorded events that did in fact happen in the decades after he said all this in the early church. So, for example, there was a famine in the empire not long after this. And in fact, we see this recorded actually in Acts 11. It says in verse 28, a severe famine was about to come over the whole inhabited world. Likewise, we know that in places like Antioch, the very famous city for the history of the church, and that city where Paul launched his mission trips from, that's where he would start and then go all around the bottom of Europe. that city there, it actually suffered several serious earthquakes, and the first of them only about 10 years after this time. And just a little later again, as Paul arrived in Italy towards the end of Acts, that area actually got hit with a very damaging earthquake just after he arrived. And then when we look at wars and the rumors of wars, well, again, there were several events that happened not long after this, and actually in Jerusalem itself, because there was the potential for a war when the Emperor of Rome, about 10 years after this, he actually wanted to put a statue of himself in the very temple that Jesus says will soon be destroyed. And then we see that there actually was a war in the year 66 where the Jews, they eventually tried to overthrow the Roman Empire from their region. They wanted rid of them. And in response to this, Jerusalem and the temple was then destroyed a few years later in 70 AD. So what we actually know from the book of Acts and even just from general history, the stones of the temple building were in fact brought down just about 40 years after Jesus said that they would here. So this means that there is a lot of soon-to-be events being talked about here in this passage. He's saying, people will see this, and these events actually did happen in the decades that all this was being said. Events that sound exactly like what he was describing here. So what that means is Jesus is saying here to the disciples, this is going to happen, and you will even see these things happen even in your lifetime, and these are the indicators that we are moving towards the end times, that these must all happen before I return. But even with that being the case, and a lot of these things already having happened, we know today that Jesus has not returned yet. And it is clear as we move further down the passage that he is talking about that day as well. He is in this description of what is to come, also focused on the very day that he will return, and that has got to be sometime in the far future from when he was saying this. Because in verse 24, he talks about the sun going dark and the entire universe being shaken. And then he says in verses 26 and 27, at that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. So that is clearly something that you cannot find having happened in a history book. That whilst you can, in fact, find the temple being destroyed, you can even go there today and see some of the ruins of that temple still there. And now the stones were thrown to the ground until the city back then was, in fact, flattened. And you can find places like Pompeii, for example, being destroyed, and the record of the earthquakes all around the Mediterranean on the lead up to that happening, which fits all this talk about these kind of events happening, the warning that they are to come. Whilst all that is our past, you can't find that part of the passage above, the Son of Man coming in the clouds, having already happened, as it is obviously an event that is yet to occur. That the world today, it is still waiting for the last day where all will be made new. So there are clearly two stages here of things that will happen. Some things will happen sometime soon from the disciples' point of view, and they'll continue to happen right up into our time as still these things are going on, and we ourselves are living in that time of famine and wars and the world going through all kinds of events. But then there are some things that will obviously happen later, and even later than what is our own time now. Just like the disciples, it is also our future. So any of this could be maybe a few years later, or maybe a few thousand years, as Jesus simply doesn't say. He's talking about all these events, but he's not giving dates. But what he does say is that sometime in the future, he will come back and he will return the same way he left. Because just as he ascended into the clouds, as we read at the start of the book of Acts, well, one day he'll come back from the clouds and the world will be judged and it will be made new. And that is the time when his kingdom will have arrived in full. And because there are these two stages, There are things that will happen along the way that we need to be ready for, which is why we see that Jesus gives both the warning of all this, but also the comfort to those who will live in this particular time period. A time period that is going to span from his resurrection until he returns, and therefore is a time period that we now live in, the age of the church, as we are waiting for this to happen. Because all through this, Jesus is giving very firm orders to be ready. That this isn't a passage of suggestions or just hints for things to consider, because everything is in, you'd say, the imperative. Be prepared is the main message. Because look at the way many of these statements start. As he goes through all these lists of things which are going to happen, look at how each of these sentences usually start. He says things like, watch out, be on your guard, let no one, pray that, do not believe it, do not go out. It's just a constant list of, this is your obligation. This is what you have to do to be ready. Because the whole thing is a list of the ways that Satan will try to deceive believers. That's the big warning that's going on here. Because we see him say in verse 22, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And then he goes on in verse 23, explaining how they are not to fall for any of this stuff and how they are to know what is true and false, because he says to them, see, I have told you ahead of time. So Jesus is saying, you now know that this is how the game is going to be played. This is what Satan's going to try and do. This is how he's going to try and undermine the church during this time. So you now know not to fall for this stuff. And as you know, well, therefore, don't believe any of it. Don't go along with it. And don't give into this. Don't let false teachers convince you that the end is tomorrow and you are to now follow their ways. Don't let them deceive you. And of course, what that means for us today is that we should therefore know today to not walk into a shop like, say, Koorong, for example, and then buy the latest, this world leader is the Antichrist. Or click on that YouTube video or that post on Facebook that says, this current issue is the proof that Jesus is only months away. Because what we've been told is not to listen to these deceivers, but instead only listen to what Jesus had to say. That there are people out there who will deceive, and it is not for your benefit, it is going to be for theirs. They're doing the work of Satan. And what he says is, and what he has made clear to us, the stuff that we are to listen to, is simply that he will come back, and after all these other little things that happen, when that happens, he'll come back in a flash. That the signs, they're only to tell you that the day is coming, but they're not to tell you the date. So don't look for that. That all we are to do is simply to be ready and not to be deceived in the meantime. Don't fall for the lies that you hear. And as we wait for that day, he simply says in verse 11, whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what you'll say. Just say what is ever given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And then as he warns how this will rip families apart and that the world will hate us, it's going to attack us. And it'll attack us because we trust in him, because we're not listening to it. He then says, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. So the big point is, Jesus is warning us that yes, it's going to be a rough ride. As between that day that he leaves this world to the day when he returns, it is not going to be easy. All these kind of things are going to happen, and they're going to keep happening. That there will be wars. There will be sicknesses and natural disasters, and Satan will use this time to attack the people of the kingdom by any way he can. But then what Jesus says is the comfort. He's saying, stay strong. Because the promise is the church is going to survive this. It will be the light to the world during these hard times until he returns. It is there to take this message of his out to all the world. And that is therefore for both the disciples and us today who are that church, who are living in this time period. That the church is his people, and he's saying the Spirit is with you. So don't worry about the things of this world, but know that in him our future is assured. He is for a fact coming back. And when that happens, he will fulfill all things and make all things new. Now, that was the first section of the passage this morning, and the larger part, laying out what will happen from when Jesus dies in Jerusalem to the day he returns, and all that we have to be ready to face in the meantime, the signs that we'll see. But now in the second section, which is only verses 32 to 37, we now see why no one knows when his return will happen, as Jesus makes it very clear that no one has this information, included himself, and that there is a good reason for this to be kept secret. There's actually a reason. We never get given a date, as this is to keep us prepared and on guard, just as he said to do in that first section. Because we see this part starts in verse 32 with him saying, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And then he goes on to describe what this will be like in the next verses, as he compares it to like a servant being left in charge of a house with no idea when the owner will come home. So Jesus is making it clear that there is going to be an abruptness in all this. It's going to be something that no one expects, no one could predict until after it's too late, if they haven't been paying attention to the fact that he will one day return. And when we look at other passages, we see the same idea of this sudden return that we have to be up and ready for, because it could happen at any moment, and it is in fact going to catch a lot of people out. People who aren't paying attention, i.e. not listening to him, are going to be caught out by this. Because we see it say in chapter 5 of Thessalonians, in the first two verses, "About times and dates we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." And when you look at chapters 24 and 25 of the Gospel of Matthew, which really records this same event that we're seeing here in Mark 13, it's a parallel passage to what we're looking at here. In that Gospel, there is just one illustration after the other of what it will be like when the last day arrives. Because we see examples and comparisons of how people in the times of Noah were suddenly caught out by the flood. Noah was prepared, but the others weren't. They just caught out. And examples of a woman going into labor. And like Thessalonians that we just looked at for briefly a moment ago, we also see a story of a thief coming in the night. The same language is used. Something no one expects. And as said before in the first section, it all shows how sudden this will happen, as all these examples are intermingled with comments such as, "You don't know the day, you don't know the hour, when you least expect it." So the point is being made very clear. You won't know when this is going to happen, and you can't possibly know, because as we've seen in these passages, even the people telling us this don't know. Because we see here that Paul had no idea when this moment will come. That it's not like he's saying, "You don't know because I won't tell you." That when he wrote to the Thessalonians, he's like, "Oh, I'm holding back some information." Because Paul himself has not had this moment revealed to him either. He hasn't been told the date. So this means Paul longed for this day and told everyone to look forward to it as well, but he had no more idea about this than we do. He also had not had this revealed to him. But then, of course, even more surprising again is what we read in the first verse of this section of Mark in verse 32 a moment ago, because it said that only the Father knows, that not the angels, not even the Son has had this revealed to them. So Jesus himself, like us and like Paul, doesn't know the day either. And this has probably created more discussion than any other verse in the Bible, because it goes right to the heart of our understanding of the Trinity and the incarnation, Jesus being both God and man. Because the issue is, how can Jesus, who is God, not know what God has planned? And the truth is, I don't think you can give an absolute answer to how all this works. How Jesus is both omniscient as God, and therefore he knows all things, and yet is clearly limited in his knowledge as he is only a man. But whilst it is a mystery in many ways, and that's the only way you can describe it, it's a mystery. We've got to be clear that we can't fully understand this. It's very complicated. Even if it's complicated, it is not totally beyond our understanding. There is a degree in which we can go, I kind of get why this would be the case. Because, for example, we know God is everywhere, right? He's omnipresent. There is nowhere where God is not. And yet Jesus as a man was obviously limited in that way. That Jesus could only be in one place at a time. So as a man, he couldn't be in two places at once. So that means he wouldn't know what was happening somewhere else on earth or somewhere else in the universe is like us. He could only know the things that were in his surroundings. Because just like us, he could only know what he could see with his eyes, hear with his ears, where he was at that moment, as he was a human just like we are. So we therefore know that as a human, there is a logical limit to what Jesus as a man knew at any one time. That he obviously couldn't be in two places at once any more than any one of us could be. But of course, we also know that as God, as he is the Son of God, and as the one whom all things were made for, and is the King of all creation, well, as that God, he is here and there and everywhere else. And more than that, he is at this moment, both yesterday and tomorrow, that as the Son of God, in his fullness, he is in all places, both physically and also, you'd say, temporally. That as he sits outside of time and he's outside of the physical universe, he is, as he calls himself, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, and he knows and sees all things. So, of course, what this all means is that as a man, he has our limits. He is in one place at one time. So he can only know on earth that which the Father has revealed to him, the information, the knowledge that he has been given. And of course, for that reason, this is why he did know amazing things beyond what any of us could possibly know. That, for example, he could know how many husbands that woman at the well had. He had that knowledge. And he could also know where to go, when to acquire a donkey in order to enter Jerusalem. He knew it was there. And we see this happen in other places and times. He knows stuff that no normal person could ever possibly know. So this means he clearly had knowledge beyond us. But what we also see is he only had knowledge which served his mission of saving his people and growing the kingdom. That there was clearly an absolute limit to what he knew as a human being like us, whilst at the same time having knowledge and wisdom beyond all people, as he is a son of God who was sent here by his Father for a purpose. And he knew all things that connected with his purpose. He could tell, yes, this temple will be destroyed, the stones will be thrown down, because that is something he needed to know. And whilst all that can be hard for us to get our head around, for us to know, for us to understand, the thing to remember is that it's not important for understanding this passage. It's interesting to know, it's interesting to think about, and it's something we should think about, but it doesn't change the message of this passage. Because the main point in all this is that just as Paul doesn't know the time, and as even Jesus doesn't know the time either, then obviously no one on earth knows when this will happen. That if anyone today says that they do, the point made in this passage here clearly shows that they don't. That they're one of those false teachers sent by Satan to deceive. No one can possibly know. Because what the message of this is going to be is that as the day has been set and it will happen just as the Father has planned, then what we need to know, all we need to know, is that we need to simply be ready for it. That just because we don't know the actual day doesn't mean that we can't be getting ourselves ready in the meantime. Because we're not to be caught off guard by this, but instead we need to be spending this day getting ready for what is that day that is to come. And even if we can't know for sure when it will happen, that doesn't mean that we can't be getting prepared now for the day that the Lord finally arrives. In fact, not knowing the day is in some ways a benefit, as it actually helps us to get more prepared than what we otherwise would be. Because not knowing is what actually keeps us on our toes. So it keeps us getting ready for this as we have to stay permanently prepared. That if the lecturer, the teacher doesn't tell you when the test is going to happen, and it could happen on any day, then you've got to keep studying and not just study the night before. Which is really the example that's been given here. The reason for why we are not being told the date, as it actually creates a test of who believes and who doesn't, who's taking this seriously. Because the example here plays out of servants who are put in charge of the owner's house whilst the owner is away. And that these servants are actually given responsibilities. They're to look after the household and to watch the door. They're given tasks. And one or two things can happen from this. They either obviously do the job, they keep watch, they look after the household, or they don't. That the owner isn't there to watch them in the meantime. But at some point he will come back, and he'll come back without any warning. And at that time, he'll then see whether they have been doing their tasks or not. And we see Jesus say about this moment, he says, do not let him find you sleeping. Basically, he's saying, don't be caught unprepared. Be doing the job in the meantime. Because what this is saying is, the servants are supposed to do what they are told, irrespective of whether the owner is there or not. That they're supposed to just do the job they've been given, and not only when the master, the owner is looking, or when they expect him to come back. They're not supposed to just suddenly do everything they had to do the night before. And that is the same idea as to why God hasn't given us a date. Because Jesus is simply saying we should be prepared for whenever he shows up. That we should be living for him irrespective of when he arrives, so we don't need to know when. Which is why not knowing is actually the incentive to make sure that we are living every day like this could be it. Like this could be the moment of his return. Because like a teenager left at home alone, if they know when their parents are coming back, then obviously they can have a wild party, they can do whatever they want, they can make the biggest mess. All they have to do is make sure that that house is cleaned up and spotless for when their parents return. But of course, if they don't know, if they just don't know when their parents are coming back, if the parents keep that secret, as they probably should do, then the kid is going to have to behave the entire time. That's the point. They can't risk having that party and the parents walking in suddenly without warning. They don't know when it could happen. And it's the same thing for us. Us not knowing the day means that we have to be ready for it to happen at literally any moment. It means right now, we've got to be living for Christ today. Because this actually could be the day that he comes back at any time. And just like no parent coming home and finding the house a mess would ever accept the excuse, I didn't know when you were coming home. Right? Imagine teenagers saying that. If you had told me that this was the moment, if I knew, then I would have covered up all the evidence that I wrongly had this wild party while you were away. You should have told me when you're coming back. Well, just like that's not going to be acceptable for any parent. Well, Jesus is the same. Right? He's the same. He's not going to accept the excuse, you came when I least expected you. You didn't give me the date. This is really your fault. I wasn't ready. So what this means is telling us the moment. It keeps us prepared for when this moment comes. That this is why we're not told when it's all going to happen. Because expecting Jesus to tell us when he will return, it's basically saying, I am going to live my life how I want. I'm not going to live for you. I'm actually going to ignore your commands. I'm not going to take up my cross. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. But just before you return, that is when I'll get my act together. When I know tomorrow is the day that I'll have to clean up this afternoon, hide the evidence of my bad behavior, then I'll do it. And if you have that kind of mentality, it's basically saying it is okay to disobey God as long as you don't get caught. It's saying to him, as long as you don't catch me, I can now do at this time whatever I want, and I don't have to live for you today, as long as I just have my affairs in line for tomorrow. But instead, by keeping us on our toes, it means that we have to be living for him all the time. Not just when we think he may be coming back to check on us. So to finish up today, we've seen this morning two main points, right? The two things that we must all know. Because we've first looked at how Christ will return. That there is actually a day set when all of this will end and his new kingdom will have arrived. And then the second thing was how we don't know when that will be. How we have to be on guard and not be found asleep and not living for him. But now to wrap up for today, we need to think about how this should all apply to our lives, because the practical implications of this are actually quite massive. Because knowing how we have to be ready for something that can happen at any time will actually have a huge impact on how it is that we live and see our life. And not only how we live as far as keeping from sin and reading God's word and being a part of the church and living the Christian life as we just kind of looked at, but even beyond that, this point about how we are to be ready for this day, this really changes everything about how we do ministry and how we live our life in that mind frame of how we take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Because think about this, if they, the disciples and those in the early church, if they knew the date, if Jesus had said here in this passage, I will return in 3,000 years from now, this is the day that I'll come back. If that future day was given right back at that time, would the early church have done all that they actually did? That is, the people at the time, if they knew they had 3,000 years to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, if Jesus gave them this massive time window of when he could return, would that have affected the growth of the early church back then? Would people have been prepared to die, taking the message out, if there was no urgency to make the gospel known to the world before the last day, that it's going to happen thousands of years after they're already dead and buried? Well, obviously it would have a big impact, and it would have a big impact in a very negative way. Because it was always that possibility that Jesus could come back tomorrow, like a thief, like the owner of the house suddenly returning, that motivated to make the most of today. That they knew they had to get out there and take the gospel to the end of the earth, because they were told to do that before he came back. That's the command they've been given. And as they didn't know when that would be, they were never given a time frame. That meant, well, we better do that soon, just in case he does, in fact, come back soon himself. So by constantly believing Jesus could return at any moment, this has actually kept the church energized for what is now the last 2,000 years. And this is why it should actually energize us now. It should motivate us to go out and tell everyone, whilst we still can, we are always one day closer to Jesus returning, so make the most of today. Because not knowing this moment, it really should motivate us to live for Jesus and to grow his church, to let all people know of his return so they too can be ready to meet him on the clouds with us. It should motivate us to tell our friends and family the gospel of Jesus today, because we never know if there will be another opportunity later on. But what this also motivates us to do is for us to just live our life. Because if you knew Jesus would come back Tuesday, would you in fact go to work tomorrow? Is there a point living out our normal life if we know the exact date it's all going to end? Because if you knew Jesus would come back on, let's say, the April the 7th, 2025, right? He's going to be back in 24 hours. If you were a student, would you study? If you're young, would you get married? Would you think about having kids? Would you bother taking out a mortgage or even learn an instrument? Would you do normal stuff? Obviously, there'd be no point. The world ends tomorrow. But we don't know that. It might, but we don't know that. So not knowing the day also means it frees us up to just get on with things now. That just like what is normal death, right? We all know we're all going to die one day, but despite this, we actually do get on with our life, and it doesn't stop us doing those things. We still do those things. You still get married and have kids, have a mortgage, learn an instrument, study. You still do normal stuff. But of course, as we also know, even in normal life, with normal death, if the doctor did say, hey, look, you've got 2 weeks to live, that does change how you live today. Because we know that any time limit, it affects how we go about our life. The moment you put a time limit on something and you go, this is the time you've got, it changes every decision going forward. So even though good health or not, this still might be our last day, right? Any of us could get hit by a bus this afternoon or something, right? Hopefully not, but you never know when it's going to end. This is why you just keep living your life like normal. So in life, you have to plan like it's not your last day. But of course, knowing the day would change how you do that. So what this means from our Christian life, the way we go about our life, it's simply live for Jesus like he might come back tomorrow, yet we still go to work, have a family, we still have reasons to get out of bed in the morning because we still live the life that God has given us and we're thankful for it. Because we just don't know how many more days we have to wait for Christ's return, so we need to make the most of every moment. We still keep living life, but we take every opportunity that comes our way. So what matters is that we live that life that we've got. And as we're living it, doing our normal things like everyone else in this world, we are in fact still living it for him. The main thing to know from all this is that day, that return, it is going to happen. It will be like the thief in the night. It will be like the owner returning. So we live right now being prepared for it and even looking forward to it, even as we just go about living our life today.